Welcome to the flight levels. There's been a lot of talk about the recent crash near Steamboat Springs of the Epic aircraft. I just watched Juan Browne's video about his opinion on the crash, and his take is that the approaches into Steamboat Springs are inherently dangerous and the FAA needs to change them immediately. I'm here to offer a counter argument that the problem is not the approach procedures. I feel the instrument approach procedures are perfectly safe. You just have to follow all of the rules they set forth. Let's get to it. Now, I specifically wanted to make this video because Juan Browne is a huge platform and I enjoy watching him. I think he has a lot of great things to say, and I think he overall improves safely immensely for the industry. I even got the opportunity to meet him once years ago at the Truckee airport at a fly-in. So if you're watching Juan, I definitely remember you. And this is not a critique of him, it's just a counter argument. So when I first saw his video, I thought we were going to agree because we usually do. But when Juan started talking about how this approach is inherently dangerous, I just completely disagree. And here's why. So let's start with how every single approach plate in the United States works, whether you're in the middle of Kansas or if you're in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. So every approach plate starts with the initial approach segment, and it defines a lateral path between one point and another one that a pilot must stay on. And then on that segment, you have your minimum altitude. And as long as you comply with being on this lateral path and staying above the minimum altitude, you are assured terrain separation. As the approach progresses, you get into the intermediate segment. Again, you have a lateral path that you need to stay on and a minimum altitude you must stay above. And then you pass the final approach fix. Then you can either, if you're on a precision approach, follow a glide path down to your decision altitude, or you can descend down to your minimum descent altitude, again staying on a lateral path. Now, if you were to perform a circling maneuver, you then need to stay on that final approach segment until you're within the defined radius of the threshold that you are intending to land on. Once you are within that radius, you can then circle, or basically turn left and right as necessary, to set yourself up to land on your intended runway. Now, in the specific instance of the Epic 100, it is capable of flying quite slowly, so it was a Category B aircraft, and at the altitude of the minimum descent altitude at Steamboat, they would have a circling radius of 2.1 miles. So as long as they would stay within 2.1 miles of the threshold of their intended runway, they are protected at that minimum descent altitude. Okay, great. So you're protected so far, but the whole point of flying an instrument approach procedure is presumably to get all the way down to the runway and land. So how do you safely descend below the minimum descent altitude? Well, glad you asked. The FARs have 91.175, which defines when you can descend below your decision altitude or minimum descent altitude. You must have what I like to call the holy trinity of requirements. You must have three things. You must have the aircraft continuously in a position to land using normal maneuvers in a normal rate of descent. You must also have the required visibility stated on the approach. And then you must also have the runway environment in sight. And this regulation goes into detail of what elements of the runway environment count. If you fail to meet any one of these three of the Holy Trinity, you cannot descend below the minimum descent altitude. Full stop. So let's talk about the approach plate that everyone's talking about right now, the RNAV Zulu to runway 32 at Steamboat Springs. So, as everyone's already talked about, in the notes section, we have circling not authorized northeast of runway 1432. And that makes sense. There is a lot of terrain to the northeast. However, To the west is a gigantic valley. The terrain is basically nothing in that direction. You are perfectly authorized to circle to the west. We also have runway 32 straight-in minimums not authorized at night. Totally good with that. There's a gigantic mountain, which is where the pilot in question crashed. We also have circling runway 32 not authorized at night. Also makes sense because at the MDA of 9,100, that circling radius of 2.1 miles puts you too close to terrain. Now, what a lot of people, including Juan, have overlooked is that circling to runway 14 is perfectly acceptable. And this approach takes that into account. As long as you circle west of the runway, where there is no terrain, you can circle and safely land on runway 14. If we even look at the VFR sectional, we can see for the standard traffic pattern, it's a right pattern to runway 14 because of that terrain to the east. To the west, there is no terrain to concern us with. Now, the analogy I like to share with students is that every instrument approach plate, again, between Kansas and the Rocky Mountains, they put terrain clearance on a silver platter and they just hand it to you. You just have to choose to eat off of it. Now, whether you choose to eat off of the silver platter or eat off the floor with your dog, I can't control that. But the safety is there built in. You just have to follow the rules either on the approach plate or provided by FAR 91.175. So to address some of the things that Juan said in his video, Juan pointed out that it would be crazy to go straight into runway 32 at night. And I completely agree with that. But so does the FAA. They don't allow that. If this pilot in question was intending to go straight in, then he's not following the rules of the silver platter. And this is not an issue of the approach plate, it was an issue of the pilot. Another thing that Juan brought up, as well as several others, is the functionality of Garmin's RNAV plus V. And you know, I feel there is a good chance that is what led the pilot to descend into the terrain. But that's a red herring. It doesn't matter. You cannot descend below MDA until you have the Holy Trinity. And I fail to believe that this pilot had the runway in sight, felt he could do normal maneuvers to do land, and had the visibility to descend below the MDA. I don't buy it. So at the end of the day, Juan Browne is right about one thing. Going straight in at night to runway 32 on this approach would be crazy. And I agree, and so does the FAA. That does not make this approach plate inherently dangerous. It means pilots who try to do what the FAA says isn't allowed, making a mistake. Safety in the cockpit is not about avoiding airports like Steamboat Springs. It's about being able to eat off of the silver platter in a safe way. If you don't know how to eat off the silver platter, then you shouldn't be eating at the table. Now, had the pilot gotten down to the MDA and realized that they couldn't comply with FAR Part 175, maybe they would have concluded that this isn't working and I need to divert to another airport like Hayden just down the road. That would have been a reasonable conclusion. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. I want to hear from you. Do you think I'm wrong defending the instrument approach plate? Or do you think it is inherently dangerous and the FAA needs to change it? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next week.